Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she carefully organized medical supplies in the dusty tent. The desert heat in Afghanistan was unbearable, even in the early morning hours. Around her, soldiers would joke and call her, just, the med tent girl, thinking she was nothing more than a volunteer who handed out bandages and aspirin. At 28, Sarah had already lived 3 different lives. Back home in Texas, she was known as a gentle nurse who worked at the local hospital. Her colleagues saw her as quiet and soft-spoken, someone who preferred reading medical journals to going out for drinks. What they didn't know was that Sarah had spent 4 years in the Marine Corps before becoming a nurse, specializing in combat medical training and tactical response. The military base where she now worked was located in a dangerous region where attacks happened almost weekly. Most of the soldiers assumed Sarah was just another civilian contractor who was too scared to leave the safety of the medical tent. They would pat her on the head and tell her to stay safe in there while they went on patrol missions. Captain Rodriguez, the base commander, had tried multiple times to convince Sarah to take a safer position at a hospital in Germany. "You don't belong out here," he would say. "This is no place for someone like you." Sarah would just smile politely and continue with her work, never bothering to correct his assumptions about her background. The truth was that Sarah had volunteered specifically for this dangerous assignment. She had requested to be stationed at one of the most volatile bases in the region because she knew her skills would be needed most here. Her personnel file contained information that would surprise everyone on the base, but Sarah preferred to keep her past private. During her evening shifts, Sarah would study the base layout and memorize every possible escape route and defensive position. She noticed patterns in the guard rotations and understood the weaknesses in their security setup. Her trained eye caught details that others missed: suspicious movements in the distance, unusual sounds that indicated potential trouble, and changes in the local population's behavior that suggested something big was coming. The other medics on the base respected Sarah's medical knowledge, but had no idea about her tactical training. They would ask her to help with routine tasks like inventory and patient care, never realizing that she could field strip a rifle faster than most of the soldiers and had been trained in advanced combat techniques. Sarah's roommate Lisa was a cheerful Army nurse from Ohio who talked constantly about her boyfriend back home. Lisa would often comment on how lucky Sarah was to have such an easy and safe job compared to the soldiers who went out on dangerous missions. Sarah would listen patiently, knowing that her friend had no idea about the real reasons she was there. The local Afghan staff who worked on the base had a different opinion of Sarah. They noticed things that the American soldiers missed. Ahmad, an interpreter who had worked with military units for over 5 years, had observed Sarah's movements and behavior. He recognized the way she carried herself and how her eyes constantly scanned for threats. One evening, he quietly approached her and said in broken English, "You are not just nurse, yes?" Sarah had looked at him carefully and simply replied, "I'm whatever this base needs me to be." As weeks passed, intelligence reports began indicating increased enemy activity in the area. The soldiers were told to be extra vigilant, but most of them still treated their daily routines casually. Sarah, however, began preparing for something she sensed was coming. She started keeping her old military gear close by and mentally rehearsed emergency procedures that she hadn't used in years. The night before everything changed, Sarah couldn't sleep. Her instincts, sharpened by years of military training, were telling her that danger was approaching. She walked through the medical tent, checking supplies and equipment one more time. As she organized the emergency trauma kits, she whispered a small prayer, knowing that tomorrow might be the day when her true identity would be revealed to everyone on the base. The morning started like any other day at Forward Operating Base Courage. Soldiers went about their routines, grabbing coffee and complaining about the heat before their shifts began. Sarah arrived at the medical tent early, as usual, but something felt different. The air seemed thicker, and the usual chatter from the local village in the distance was absent. Ahmad, the interpreter, approached Sarah during the morning briefing with a worried expression. His uncle lived in the nearby village and had sent word that most families had quietly left during the night. "Miss Sarah," he said nervously, "my uncle says the people are scared. They heard talk of big attack coming soon. Sarah thanked him and immediately went to find Captain Rodriguez, but he was already in a closed-door meeting with his officers. When Sarah finally spoke with the captain an hour later, he dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "Sarah, I appreciate you caring, but let us handle the security matters. You just focus on keeping the medical supplies organized." His tone was kind, but patronizing, treating her like a worried civilian who didn't understand military operations. Throughout the morning, Sarah noticed other warning signs that made her increasingly anxious. The guard dogs were restless and kept looking toward the hills surrounding the base. Radio chatter seemed more intense than usual, and she overheard fragments of conversations about unusual movement in the area. Most concerning was the fact that the local staff who usually arrived early for their shifts were either late or missing entirely. Private Jenkins, a young soldier from Georgia, came to the medical tent complaining of a headache. While Sarah checked his blood pressure, she casually asked him about the patrol schedules for the day. "Same old boring routine," he said. "Captain says we're keeping normal operations. Nothing special happening." This confirmed Sarah's worst fear. The base leadership wasn't taking the threat seriously enough. During lunch, Sarah approached Sergeant Collins, a seasoned soldier who had been deployed multiple times. She knew he had good instincts and might listen to her concerns. "Sergeant, I've been hearing things that worry me about today. Have you noticed anything unusual?" Collins looked at her with a mixture of amusement and affection. "Sarah, honey, you're too nervous. This place has been quiet for weeks. You need to relax and let us soldiers handle the dangerous stuff." Frustrated but not surprised by the response, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. She began quietly preparing the medical tent for a mass casualty event. She moved the most critical supplies to easily accessible locations and set up additional trauma stations. When Lisa asked what she was doing, Sarah simply said she wanted to be extra prepared just in case. By mid-afternoon, Sarah's anxiety had reached a peak. She found herself checking and rechecking her personal equipment, including the tactical gear she kept hidden in her private locker. The Marine training that she had worked so hard to forget was now surfacing with crystal clarity. Every sound seemed amplified, and her senses were on high alert. The base's communications specialist, Corporal Thompson, mentioned during his routine check of the medical tent that they had been getting some weird interference on certain radio frequencies. "Probably just atmospheric conditions," he said casually. But Sarah knew that enemy forces often used jamming techniques before launching attacks, and this detail sent chills down her spine. As evening approached, Sarah made a decision that could cost her job but might save lives. She approached the three most experienced soldiers she could find, Sergeant Collins, Corporal Davis, and Staff Sergeant Williams, and asked to speak with them privately. In a quiet corner of the mess tent, she looked them directly in the eyes and said, "I need you to trust me on something important. Tonight is going to be different, and you need to be ready." The soldiers looked at her with confusion and mild concern. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" asked Collins. "Are you feeling okay?" Sarah took a deep breath and made a choice that would change everything. "I used to be a Marine," she said quietly. 4 years, including combat training. Everything I'm seeing today tells me we're about to be hit hard and soon." The three soldiers stared at her in shock. Staff Sergeant Williams was the first to speak. "You're serious, aren't you?" Sarah nodded. "Dead serious. And if I'm right, tonight is going to test every single person on this base." As if responding to her words, the evening call to prayer from a distant mosque was unusually absent, leaving an eerie silence hanging over the entire area. Word spread quickly among the experienced soldiers about Sarah's Marine background and her warnings. By dinner time, a small group had formed around her, asking questions and seeking details about what she expected to happen. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had served 2 previous tours, found himself believing her instincts. "Marines don't make stuff up," he told the others. "If she's worried, maybe we should be too." Captain Rodriguez was not pleased when he learned that Sarah had been spreading panic among his troops. He called her to his office just after sunset, clearly frustrated. "Sarah, I understand you're concerned, but you can't go around scaring my soldiers with wild theories. You're a medic, not intelligence personnel. Sarah stood at attention, a posture that surprised the captain with its military precision. Sir, with respect, I believe this base is about to come under significant attack tonight. The captain studied her face carefully, perhaps seeing something he had missed before. What makes you so certain? Sarah explained about the missing villagers, the restless animals, the radio interference, and the absence of normal evening sounds from the surrounding area. As she spoke, Rodriguez realized that her observations were remarkably detailed and tactically sound. Even if you're right, he said finally, I can't change our entire security posture based on a hunch. After leaving the captain's office, Sarah returned to the medical tent with a heavy heart. She had done everything she could to warn the leadership, but now she had to prepare for the consequences of their dismissal. Lisa noticed her friend's serious mood and tried to cheer her up with jokes about their upcoming leave time. In 3 weeks, we'll be back home drinking real coffee and sleeping in real beds, Lisa said cheerfully, not realizing that Sarah was mentally preparing for a battle. The soldiers who had listened to Sarah's warnings began quietly making their own preparations. Sergeant Collins checked his rifle twice and made sure his ammunition was easily accessible. Corporal Davis moved his gear closer to his sleeping area and informed his squad members to stay alert. Staff Sergeant Williams went so far as to conduct an unofficial inspection of the perimeter defenses, noting several weak points that concerned him. Ahmad found Sarah during the evening meal and pulled her aside. Miss Sarah, my cousin who works at the checkpoint, says 3 trucks with covered loads passed by this afternoon. The drivers were not from our village. This information confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The enemy was likely positioning equipment and personnel for a coordinated attack. She thanked Ahmad and advised him to stay close to the most fortified buildings on the base. As night fell, Sarah made her final preparations. She retrieved her Marine Corps gear from its hiding place and laid it out systematically. Tactical vest, helmet, weapon, ammunition, and medical supplies configured for combat conditions. The transformation from med-tent girl to combat-ready Marine felt both familiar and strange after so many years of civilian life. Private Jenkins stopped by the medical tent around 10 o'clock, complaining again about his headache. As Sarah gave him some aspirin, she noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Are you nervous about something? She asked gently. Jenkins looked around to make sure no one else was listening. Some of the guys are saying you think we're gonna get attacked tonight. Is it true? Sarah looked into his young eyes and decided to be honest. It's possible. Just stay alert and follow your training if anything happens. The base settled into its nighttime routine, but Sarah could sense the tension among those who knew about her warnings. Guard duty rotations proceeded normally, but she noticed that the soldiers she had spoken with were more vigilant than usual. They stood straighter, scanned their sectors more carefully, and kept their weapons at the ready instead of slung casually over their shoulders. Around midnight, Sarah was organizing medical supplies when she heard Corporal Davis's voice over the radio calling for a routine security check. The response from the outer perimeter post came back normal, but Sarah detected something in the guard's voice that made her pause. It was too calm, almost forced, as if the soldier was trying to sound routine while feeling anything but normal. The temperature had dropped significantly, and a light wind was carrying unusual sounds across the desert. Sarah stepped outside the medical tent and stood perfectly still, using her Marine training to filter and analyze every noise. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of engines, not the familiar rumble of American vehicles, but something different, something that didn't belong. At 12:30 in the morning, Sarah made a decision that went against all protocol. She put on her tactical gear, checked her weapon, and began moving toward the command center. If her instincts were right, the attack would begin soon, and she wanted to be in position to help coordinate the medical response. As she walked through the quiet base, she whispered a prayer for the safety of every person sleeping peacefully, unaware that their world was about to explode into chaos. The last thing Sarah remembered thinking before everything changed was how strange it felt to be wearing her Marine uniform again after so many years of scrubs and stethoscopes. In a few minutes, Everyone on the base would discover that their quiet, med tent girl was actually a warrior who had been preparing for this moment all along. The first explosion shattered the midnight silence at exactly 1:17 a.m. Sarah felt the ground shake beneath her feet as a massive fireball erupted from the main gate. Within seconds, the peaceful base transformed into a war zone as mortar rounds began raining down from the surrounding hills. The coordinated attack she had predicted was happening exactly as she had feared. Chaos erupted immediately. Soldiers stumbled out of their sleeping quarters in various states of undress, grabbing weapons and trying to understand what was happening. The alarm sirens wailed across the base as automatic gunfire opened up from multiple directions. Sarah's Marine training kicked in instantly. While others were still processing the situation, she was already moving with purpose toward her first objective. "This is not a drill. We are under attack." Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio system. Sarah could hear the shock and panic in his tone as he tried to coordinate a response to something he hadn't prepared for. The base's defensive positions were being overwhelmed by the intensity and coordination of the assault. Enemy fighters had clearly studied their routines and were exploiting every weakness. Private Jenkins ran past Sarah in complete panic, his rifle held incorrectly, and his eyes wide with terror. This was his first real combat experience, and he was freezing up under pressure. Sarah grabbed his arm and looked directly into his eyes. "Jenkins, listen to me. Remember your training. Breathe. You've got this." Her calm, authoritative voice cut through his panic, and she watched as he straightened up and got control of himself. The medical tent was taking indirect fire from mortar fragments, and Lisa was crouched behind a supply cabinet, crying and calling for help. Sarah burst through the tent entrance and immediately began barking orders like the Marine squad leader she had once been. "Lisa, stop crying and start moving wounded to the back corner. Set up 3 trauma stations. Now!" The transformation in Sarah's demeanor was so complete that Lisa stopped crying and began following orders without question. Sergeant Collins appeared at the tent entrance, bleeding from a shrapnel wound on his forehead. "Sarah, we've got multiple casualties coming in. The bastards hit us from 4 different directions at once." Sarah was already moving, her hands working with practiced efficiency to set up emergency medical stations. "How many wounded?" she asked while simultaneously preparing trauma supplies. "At least 8 that I know of. Probably more coming." The base's communication systems were being jammed, making coordination difficult. Sarah realized that her medical tent was becoming the unofficial command center simply because it was one of the few places with clear lines of sight to multiple areas of the base. She could see Staff Sergeant Williams rallying a group of soldiers near the armory, trying to establish a defensive perimeter. As the first seriously wounded soldier was carried into the tent, Sarah's training took complete control. The scared med tent girl disappeared entirely, replaced by a combat medic who had trained for exactly this scenario. Her hands moved with surgical precision as she assessed injuries, prioritized treatment, and shouted orders to everyone around. Davis, apply pressure to that wound. Lisa, start an IV on the soldier by the door. Jenkins, I need you to help carry stretchers." Captain Rodriguez appeared at the tent entrance, his uniform torn and his face blackened with smoke. When he saw Sarah in full tactical gear, efficiently managing the medical response while simultaneously coordinating defensive positions, his mouth dropped open. "Sarah, what the hell?" She cut him off immediately. "Sir, we can discuss my background later. Right now I need you to tell me where you're positioning the wounded evacuation point." The attack intensified as enemy fighters moved closer to the base perimeter. Explosions were getting louder and more frequent, and Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of RPG rounds whistling overhead. Through the tent opening, she could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as her fellow soldiers fought desperately to hold their defensive lines. Corporal Thompson burst into the tent, his radio equipment damaged and his arm hanging at an unusual angle. "Sarah, the command center took a direct hit. Rodriguez is down, and Williams is trying to coordinate the defense from the armory. We need medical support at the west wall immediately." Sarah looked at the chaos around her medical tent, then at Thompson's injured arm and made a split-second decision. Lisa, you're in charge of the tent. Keep treating the wounded and don't let anyone die on my watch. Sarah grabbed her weapon, a trauma bag, and looked back at her friend. I'm going out there. Lisa stared at her in shock. Sarah, you can't. You're not a soldier. Sarah paused at the tent entrance and turned back with a grim smile. Actually, I am. As Sarah moved across the base toward the west wall, dodging mortar fragments and returning fire when necessary, soldiers who saw her had to do double takes. The quiet woman who had served them aspirin and bandages was now moving with the fluid precision of a seasoned combat veteran. She bound wounded soldiers where she found them, provided covering fire for evacuation teams, and somehow managed to be everywhere at once. The battle was far from over, but something had changed in the base's defensive response. Word was spreading quickly among the soldiers that their med tent girl was actually a trained Marine who had been preparing for this exact situation. Morale was shifting from panic to determined resistance, and Sarah Martinez was at the center of that transformation. Sarah reached the west wall just as a group of enemy fighters was attempting to breach the perimeter fence. Staff Sergeant Williams was pinned down behind a concrete barrier with 3 wounded soldiers, unable to move them to safety without exposing himself to heavy gunfire. When he saw Sarah approaching in full combat gear, weapon ready and moving with tactical precision, his expression changed from surprise to relief. Sarah, thank God you're here. Martinez took shrapnel to the leg, and Johnson's got a chest wound. I can't get them out of here. Sarah assessed the situation quickly, her Marine training automatically calculating angles, cover positions, and extraction routes. Give me 30 seconds, then provide covering fire toward that hilltop. Without waiting for a response, she was already moving. What happened next would be talked about for years among the soldiers who witnessed it. Sarah moved across the open ground with the fluid grace of a seasoned warrior, her rifle providing precise covering fire while she simultaneously treated wounded soldiers. She reached Martinez first, quickly applying a combat tourniquet to stop the bleeding while bullets whistled overhead. Her movements were so smooth and confident that the wounded soldier actually felt safer. Martinez, you're going to be fine. I'm getting you out of here. Her voice was calm and authoritative, completely different from the gentle tone soldiers were used to hearing from the medical tent. She dragged him to better cover, then immediately went back for Johnson despite the intense enemy fire. Staff, Sergeant Williams watched in amazement as she worked, realizing that he was seeing a level of combat skill that exceeded most of the soldiers on the base. While treating Johnson's chest wound, Sarah noticed movement in her peripheral vision that made her freeze. 3 enemy fighters were approaching their position from an unexpected angle, using the darkness and confusion to get dangerously close. Without hesitation, she grabbed her rifle and engaged them with deadly accuracy, dropping all 3 before they could threaten the wounded soldiers. The sound of Sarah's rifle fire was different from the panicked shooting happening elsewhere on the base. Each shot was deliberate and controlled, the mark of someone who had been trained to make every bullet count. Williams watched her reload with practiced efficiency while continuing to monitor Johnson's vital signs. Sarah, where the hell did you learn to shoot like that? He asked in amazement. Quantico, she replied simply, referring to the Marine Corps training base where she had learned her combat skills years earlier. Staff Sergeant, I need you to help me move these wounded back to the medical tent. Can you handle Martinez while I carry Johnson? Williams nodded, still processing the revelation that his med tent girl was actually a highly trained Marine veteran. The journey back to the medical tent became a running battle. Enemy fighters were now inside the base perimeter, and Sarah found herself fighting a series of small engagements while protecting the wounded soldiers. Her rifle work was precise and deadly, but what impressed Williams most was how she never lost focus on her medical responsibilities even while engaging the enemy. When they reached the medical tent, Lisa nearly fainted at the sight of Sarah covered in dust and blood carrying wounded soldiers while her rifle was still smoking from recent use. Sarah, what happened to you out there? Sarah gently placed Johnson on a stretcher and immediately began working to stabilize his condition. I became who I needed to be, she replied while inserting an IV line with steady hands. Captain Rodriguez, who had been treated for his injuries and was now mobile again, entered the tent and stopped dead in his tracks. Sarah was simultaneously coordinating the medical response, providing tactical advice over the radio, and treating seriously wounded soldiers. The transformation was so complete that he barely recognized the quiet woman he had dismissed earlier that day. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," Rodriguez said quietly, "and an explanation about why you requested assignment to this base." Sarah looked up from the soldier she was treating, her eyes meeting his with a directness that hadn't been there before. "Captain, I came here because I knew my skills would be needed. I just didn't expect to need all of them on the same night." The battle was beginning to turn in their favor. Enemy fighters were being pushed back from the perimeter, and the coordinated attack was losing its momentum. But Sarah knew the night wasn't over yet. Through her tactical training, she could sense that this initial assault was likely a probing attack designed to test their defenses and identify weaknesses for a larger assault to come. As if confirming her suspicions, Ahmad burst into the medical tent with urgent news. "Miss Sarah, my cousin at the checkpoint says many more trucks are coming. Much bigger force this time." Sarah processed this information quickly, realizing that the worst was yet to come. She looked around at the wounded soldiers, her exhausted medical staff, and the damaged base defenses. "Captain," she said with the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard, "we need to prepare for a second wave, and this time they're going to come with everything they've got." Rodriguez nodded grimly, finally understanding that the woman he had underestimated might be the key to their survival. The quiet med tent girl was gone forever, replaced by Marine Sergeant Sarah Martinez, combat veteran and warrior, and the night was far from over. The second wave hit just before dawn, exactly as Sarah had predicted. This time, the enemy came with heavier weapons, more fighters, and a better understanding of the base's defensive capabilities. But they made one critical miscalculation. They expected to face the same unprepared defenders they had encountered in the first attack. Instead, they found a base that had been reorganized under the tactical guidance of someone who understood both combat medicine and military strategy. Sarah had spent the brief lull between attacks doing something that amazed every soldier who witnessed it. She had simultaneously coordinated the medical treatment of 17 wounded soldiers while providing tactical advice that helped reorganize their entire defensive strategy. Captain Rodriguez had given her unofficial authority to make decisions, and she used it to position their limited resources with maximum effectiveness. When the attack resumed, the difference was immediately apparent. Soldiers who had been panicked and disorganized a few hours earlier were now fighting with confidence and coordination. They had seen their med tent girl transform into a warrior, and her calm competence under fire had given them something they desperately needed: hope that they could survive the night. The enemy's second assault focused on the medical tent, apparently having identified it as a command center during the earlier fighting. Sarah had anticipated this and had quietly moved the most critically wounded to a more secure location. When the attack began, she was ready. What the enemy fighters found was not a vulnerable medical facility, but a fortress defended by someone who had been trained for exactly this situation. Sarah's defense of the medical tent became the stuff of legend among the soldiers who witnessed it. Using her knowledge of the base layout and her tactical training, she had prepared multiple defensive positions and escape routes. When enemy fighters breached the outer perimeter, they walked into carefully planned crossfire that eliminated the threat efficiently and decisively. Private Jenkins, who had been terrified during the first attack, found himself fighting alongside Sarah with a courage he didn't know he possessed. Watching her calm professionalism under fire had taught him more about being a soldier in one night than months of training exercises. "Sarah, how are you so calm?" he asked during a brief pause in the fighting. "Because panic gets people killed," she replied while reloading her rifle. "Stay focused and we'll all go home." As the sun began to rise over the desert, the enemy attack finally broke apart. The coordinated assault had failed, partly due to the base's improved defensive response, but mostly because they had underestimated the impact of having a trained Marine coordinating both the medical and tactical response. Sarah had proven that her dual expertise made her far more valuable than anyone had realized. The aftermath revealed the full scope of what had happened during that night. Sarah had personally treated over 20 wounded soldiers, coordinated the evacuation of critical casualties, engaged enemy fighters in direct combat, and provided tactical guidance that may have saved the entire base. Her transformation from med tent girl to combat leader had become the turning point of the battle. Captain Rodriguez found Sarah sitting quietly outside the medical tent as the morning light revealed the extent of the damage. She had finally removed her tactical gear and was back in her medical uniform, but something fundamental had changed. The quiet, unassuming woman was gone, replaced by someone who carried herself with the confidence of a proven warrior. "Sarah, I need to ask you something," Rodriguez said as he sat down beside her. "Why didn't you tell me about your Marine background when you first arrived?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because I wanted to be useful for my medical skills, not my military experience. I thought I was done being a warrior." She paused and looked at the soldiers moving around the base, many of whom nodded respectfully as they passed. "I guess some things never really leave you." The official report of the attack would mention Sarah's exceptional performance under fire and recommend her for military honors. But among the soldiers who had fought beside her that night, her reputation was already established. She was no longer the gentle med tent girl they had protected and patronized. She was Marine Sergeant Sarah Martinez, combat veteran, lifesaver, and warrior. News of the attack and Sarah's role in defending the base spread throughout the military network. Within days, she was receiving requests from other bases that wanted her expertise. Military commanders who had previously seen her as just a medic were now competing for her services, understanding that her unique combination of medical and combat skills made her invaluable. But Sarah's greatest satisfaction came from something much simpler. When Private Jenkins stopped by the medical tent a week after the attack, he stood at attention and addressed her properly for the first time. "Sergeant Martinez, I wanted to thank you for saving my life and teaching me how to be a soldier." Sarah smiled, the same gentle smile that had once seemed so innocent, and replied, "Private, you were always a soldier. You just needed to discover it for yourself." The base returned to its routine, but everything had changed. The medical tent was now treated with the respect due to someone who had proven herself in combat. Sarah continued her work as a medic, but now everyone understood that she was much more than that. She was a guardian, a warrior, and a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people are those who appear most harmless. Ahmad, the interpreter who had been the first to recognize Sarah's true nature, summed it up best when he told his cousin, "The Americans have a saying about still waters running deep. That woman is proof that the quietest person in the room might also be the most dangerous."